Good morning and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar series entitled Revitalizing Socioecological Production Landscape and Seascape. I am Marnie Orejenes, your host for today. This webinar aims to raise awareness on the conservation and sustainable use of socio-ecological production, landscape, and seascapes through a series of online talks from our expert on the Satoyama landscape as approaches to sustainable management and biodiversity conservation. To everyone, please feel free to introduce yourself using the Zoom chat box. If possible, please include your organization and location. Before we begin, we would like to remind you of some of our webinar guidelines. Please turn off your microphone, and if you have questions, please use the Zoom chat box. And lastly, we will provide a link to the evaluation form for your e-certificates later. To formally start our program, we would like to call our webinar organizer and project leader, professor at the Institute of Biological Sciences, College of Arts and Sciences, University of the Philippines, Los Baños. Let us all welcome Dr. Inocencio Buo, Jr. for the opening remarks. Sir?
Thank you, Marnie. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your interest in participating in this webinar series on revitalizing the socio-ecological production landscapes and seascapes in the Philippines. Since 2004, we have been studying socio-ecological production landscapes and seascapes, or we call this sometimes Satoyama. The original was the word Satoyama. The concept is anchored on the principle, or we call it the philosophy, of living in harmony with nature. Satoyama initiative has been approved by the Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity in 2010 as a strategy towards biodiversity conservation. Since then, since 2010, there were several initiatives organized by the International Partnership for the Satoyama Initiative, where UP Open University and UP Los Baños are active institutional members. This webinar series on revitalizing socio-ecological production landscapes in our country is initiated by our current project on the biophysical assessment of socio-ecological production landscapes under the program funded by the Emerging Interdisciplinary Research, or EIDR, of the University of the Philippines system. And the title of our program is Building Climate Smart Communities, or bSMART for short. And this is implemented by the UP Open University and led by our program leader, Dr. Ricardo Bagarinaw, and our program manager, Dr. Joane Serrano of UP Open University. This program is in collaboration with UP Los Baños, Caraga State University in Butuan, the Bicol University in Legazpi, and the Visayas State University in Leyte, in Baybay, Leyte. Through this monthly webinar series, we would like to enhance awareness of the socio-ecological production landscapes and seascapes, or the Satoyama concept, as a strategic approach in biodiversity conservation. Also, ecosystem landscape conservation. Our first topic is about the status of the Philippine Satoyama landscapes. This will provide the basic knowledge of the varied socio-ecological production landscapes in our country. We are enjoining everyone to walk with us in our monthly webinar series until December 31, 2022. If you want to further study socio-ecological production landscapes, or the Satoyama concept, visit our website or our FB page. And this will be flashed later in our chat box. Feel free to collaborate with us. We would be happy to have you in our network. I am hoping for a very productive and very fruitful discussion after our first installment of our webinar series. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Buot, for that warm welcome for today's webinar. Moving on, let us introduce our speaker for today's webinar. Our speaker for today's webinar is a project research assistant of the Emerging Interdisciplinary Research Building Climate Smart Communities program. She completed her Bachelor of Science in Forestry at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. She also finished her Master's of Science in Forestry, major in Forest Resource Management, also at UPLB. Her research interests include watershed management, social forestry, landscape ecology, biodiversity conservation, and application of geographic information system in environment and natural resources management. Ladies and gentlemen, our speaker for today's webinar is none other than Ms. Frances Buhay. Let us all give a virtual round of applause to Ms. Buhay.
Thank you very much, Marnie. So good morning, everyone. Hi, I can see here someone from General Santos. Hello, good morning po. Good morning to our partners from CSU and VU and the VSU. So let me just share my screen po so we could start na po.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of our main author, Dr. Inocencio Buot Jr., and co-authors Assistant Professor Mark Anthony Ravena and Assistant Professor Desiree Antoinette Fernandez, I am honored to present to you our study on socio-ecological production landscapes in the Philippines, status, problems, and future directions. Here is a brief overview of my presentation today. First, we'll briefly define the socio-ecological production landscapes, or SEPLS, and then what do SEPLS look like in the Philippine scenario, and what are the existing threats. This will be followed by the objectives and the methods, and then the discussion on the identified SEPLS or Satoyama Landscapes in the Philippines, its contributions to sustainable development, and the pressing problems and identified challenges, as well as the possible steps for us to move forward, and then a conclusion of the study. The International Partnership for Satoyama Initiative, or IPSI, defined SEPLS as dynamic biocultural mosaics of habitats and land uses where the interaction between people and the landscape maintains or enhances biodiversity while providing humans with the goods and services needed for their well-being. SEPL is known for its many names around the world. In Spain, it is known as Dehesa, Ahuapua'a in Hawaii, and Satoyama in Japan. This is what a typical SEPL or Satoyama landscape in the Philippines look like. This particular landscape is found in Ifugao. It consists of forest patches known as muyong with adjacent rice paddies locally known as payo. These and other agricultural areas are located along the hillside, adjacent to human settlements. In the nearby localities, forest is referred to as pinucho or pinubo. Different terms are also used according to the dialect of the provinces. For instance, locals from the mountain province refer to forest as lakon or batangan or saguday. In Cebu, they refer to forest as lasang or buntod, while in southern Luzon and Bicol region refer to it as gubat. There are many SEPLs around the globe that are called by various names and have different management systems linked to its cultural and indigenous knowledge. These landscapes are covered with patches of farmlands, forest villages, grasslands, and local community, which are generally seen among cultural landscapes in rural areas in many parts of the world, and they contribute significantly to the community's well-being. However, the Philippine SEPLS are threatened due to population pressure brought by rapid migration of families suffering from poverty in the lowlands and land use policy. Human activities have profoundly influenced and shaped the ecosystems and landscapes through centuries, and human impacts have affected biodiversity and other ecological processes. Additional threats, such as increasing human demands, rapid urbanization, industrialization, and climate change, are perpetual challenge in achieving biodiversity, conservation, and sustainable living. The objectives of this study is to provide an updated list of the socio-ecological production landscapes here in the Philippines, to determine the status and problems of these landscapes, and to analyze the role of these landscapes in sustainable development, particularly in agriculture and in the natural resources sector, and to map future directions of the Philippine SEPLS. This study reviewed local and international scientific literature. The keywords we used here were socio-ecological landscapes in the Philippines, Satoyama Philippines, production landscapes, biocultural, agricultural, and traditional rural landscapes, traditional agroforestry systems, mostly found in repositories and search engines such as Google Scholar, ResearchGate, Science Direct, Taylor and Francis, Wiley and Sons, and the IPSI website, Journal of Asian Studies, and Biodiversitas, among many others. This table shows the first three Satoyama landscape types identified by Buot and Usumi in 2004. 9 more were included in this presentation, making a total of 12 Satoyama landscapes in the Philippines. Undeniably, rice is the #1 staple food in the Philippines and in many parts of Asia. Hence, it has been the main crop in many Satoyama landscapes. The range of varieties used are from the most common to the most rare heritage rice in many indigenous communities. Common rice varieties are also used by most farms throughout the Philippines, while the heirloom rice is used in Banawe, Mayoyao, and in many parts of Ifugao, Mountain Province, and other provinces with actively engaged indigenous farming systems. Satoyama landscape with vegetable as main crop is a unique type of landscape documented in the highlands of northern Luzon. Vegetables are located along the slopes in high elevations of Mount Pulag and in Mount Akiki, mostly for family consumption, while the extra harvest are sold to the market. In the uplands of Bicol region, Mountain Province, and Bataan, local communities are into sweet potato farming system, commonly cultivated at the rain-fed terraced fields along the mountain sides, river banks, mountain slope of Sweden farms, as well as in home gardens. The Satoyama landscape with gabi or taro as main crop is mostly cultivated by the Tagbanwa tribe in Palawan, present in farms, home gardens, which is used for subsistence. The indigenous Ivatans in Batanes engaged in root crop-based farming system practiced all year round to maintain food security during the typhoon season. Wild gabi was also found in patches along stream banks and grasslands on the lower slopes of Mount Apo in North Cotabato. Cassava was considered an important crop in farms located at Bukidnon, Lanao del Sur, Bohol, and Negros Occidental. It is an essential crop mainly because of its ability to grow in highly degraded soils, particularly with low fertility and high acidity. Hence, cassava is a suitable crop and usually cultivated after an intensive agricultural activity. Generally, farm landscapes in Quezon and Bicol region are dominated by coconut. It is known for its various uses from food to construction materials. Hence, many multiple cropping systems are composed of coconut, multi-cropped with banana and other crops. While in typhoon-prone areas like Albay, Leyte, locals employ indigenous farming practices like coconut-based vegetable farms as protection to immature plants. The next identified Satoyama type is where coffee is the dominant crop. The Saludon and Ati ethnic groups located in the mountainous area of Iloilo have been employing coffee-based farming system. This is also evident in Kalinga and in higher elevations of Quezon Province, Cavite, Benguet, and Batangas. Coffee-based agroforestry systems are commonly cultivated and intercropped by subsistence farmers with annual crops to diversify food supply for families and stabilize annual yield. Cacao-based farms are found around the Guba or Giba, which is the local term for old-growth forest in Palawan. The Tagbanwas or the ethnic community engage in cacao-based farming systems to move their attention from shifting cultivation. And cacao is commonly planted below tall, mature trees intercropped in agroforestry farm. Satoyama with tobacco as the main crop in Cebu is cultivated as a component during dry season in an indigenous agroforestry farming system called Naalad. Tobacco-based farms were also recognized in La Union and in Pangasinan, as well as in low mountain ranges of Isabela, cultivated by the local tribe called Ibanags. Lastly, the Satoyama landscape with rice as main crop mixed with aquaculture product, which is mostly fish. Although this is not widely practiced in the Philippines, ifugaos are also known in rice fish farming culture. Similar farms on agri aquaculture is found in Cavite and in the swamps connecting Pampanga and Bulacan. This practice is known in replacement to rice monoculture because rice fish system is observed to produce greater yield. Now that we have described and identified the SEPL or Satoyama landscape types in the Philippines, let us now discuss what are the contributions of these landscapes in sustainable development. Generally, these are based on activities and aims of the case studies that have already been implemented under the IPSI programs in the Philippines. The figures that you see on the left primarily contribute to the following SDGs, such as decent work and economic growth, climate action, life on land, and partnership for the goals. While the rest of the SDGs are secondary or can be described to add minimally, but overall, these initiatives have contributed to the development of plants and management systems in the Ifugao Rice Terraces and other few SEPL in the country. This diagram shows how complex the problems are and how they are interconnected with one another. The broken line represents the indirect effect towards another problem. And as we see here below, poverty has an effect towards overexploitation of natural resources and trigger poor families to migrate from the lowlands to the uplands where natural resources are accessible and where forests are often cleared. The human activities present in these landscapes are relatively high when population is increasing in these areas. And climate change impacts, such as the heavy rainfall, induce more soils to be eroded. The drought and the rapid change in microclimate induce pest and disease outbreaks, which leads to poor yield of harvest. Moreover, the loss of indigenous culture and tradition is caused by the aging farmers and is associated with the youth's lack of interest and loyalty. And this is a pressing concern among the youth of Ifugaos. Rapid modernization and even technological advancements can be a factor of this. And we can see all these problems lead to the degradation of our SEPLs, and its impacts are detrimental, leading to unsustainability, loss of biocultural diversity, and weak ecosystem services, which will in turn affect the society's well-being today and in the future generations. This is an example of a land use change found in Mount Bayon Natural Park, a protected area located at the center of a highly populated city. From 1983, we can see initially the vast agricultural area colored in yellow. In 2003, shrubs are growing and expanding from this time. Several years later, we can see the transformation of the shrubs into an open forest, but later on again changed into grassland. Perhaps this has been extracted by the residents surrounding the mountain. But it also observed that the expansion of intensive agriculture areas represented by the orange color. This graph is sourced from the Philippine Statistics Authority and the United Nations Population Estimates and Projections. We can see here at the bottom right, the annual population growth rate has decreased significantly since the 1960s, where it was from 3.3% to the present, where it is about 1.3%. Nevertheless, the current population in the Philippines is about 112 million people and is projected to increase until 2080 with an estimate of 153 million people. With that being said, so what are the future directions now of the Philippine SEPLS? First, we need to regulate the population. Here in the Philippines, we do have laws such as Population Act, which has been passed and legislated as a strategy for national development. Population management programs were previously conducted, yet somehow in our present time it is not enough to minimize the rapid land use change and degradation of our natural resources. So, we also need to act on alleviating poverty by providing more sustainable livelihood programs and initiatives to preserve our remaining ancestral lands. This can be made possible when we empower our indigenous peoples, communities, and especially the youth, strengthen the indigenous sustainable management practices, and ensure government support, implementation of programs, and equitable sharing. In conclusion, there are many Satoyama or SEPL in the Philippines that are yet to be studied further. These cultural landscapes continue to fight over the impacts of poverty, population pressure, and proliferation of modern agricultural practices, which have exacerbated the erosion of indigenous knowledge system. There is harmony between nature and society, and this have been proven thousands of years ago we need to reinstate it again today for the future of our socio-ecological production landscapes. It is proven that the SEPL's sustainability is one strategy to conserve our rich biodiversity. In return, it will intensify the stability of the ecosystem services to everyone. We would like to thank the Office of the Vice President for Academic Affairs of the University of the Philippines System for funding this project under the Emerging Interdisciplinary Research Program. We'd also like to extend our gratitude to UP Open University and UP Los Baños. That is all, and thank you so much for your kind attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Anne, for that excellent and comprehensive presentation regarding the problems and future direction of socio-ecological production landscape in the Philippines. I'm sure our audience learned a lot from your presentation. Just to remind everyone that if you have any questions about the presentation, please type it into the chat box and we will acknowledge them later after the discussion. Also, the link of the evaluation form will be shared in the comment section after the Q&A session. At this moment, let's proceed to the discussion part. Today, we have a guest discussant to give a deeper insight to our topic this morning. And so with that, please allow me to begin introducing our discussant for today's webinar. Our discussant is a professor at the University of the Philippines, Open University. She served as the current director of the Office of Public Affairs. She obtained her Bachelor of Science in Development Communication, Master of Management, major in Development Management, and Doctor of Philosophy, major in Development Communication from the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. She teaches environmental advocacy, communication of scientific and technical information, and socio-cultural perspective of the environment. She has a wide array of research interests, including sustainability, socio-cultural perspective, development, environmental communication, health promotion, and distance e-learning. She is currently the editor-in-chief of the Open University, a University of the Philippines Open University Managed Journal of the Management and Development Studies. She has published more than 30 publications, presented in 90 conferences, and more than 60 public service engagement. Her recent international engagement are won by Walking Network initiated by University of Gothenburg, University of Plymouth, Abu Academy, University of Oulu, Digital Trust and Intuition with focus on sustainability with Ostopalia University, and Satoyama Initiative with international partnership for Satoyama Initiatives and Satoyama Development Mechanism. As part of her commitment to a lifelong learning and sustainability, she continues to find ways of discovering innovation that will help improve education and research practices in the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all give a warm virtual clap to our guest discussant today, Dr. Joane V. Serrano.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for that very generous introduction. I was surprised, but congratulations, Anne, and the team, Dr. Buot, Mark, and Des, for very comprehensive discussion on the current status as well as the future directions of Satoyama and its role in the global landscape, not just in the Philippines, not just in Japan, but globally as well. So in the interest of time, I made a presentation, so my discussion would be more organized. So I hope you don't mind me presenting, but I just want to thank Sir Buot. Hi, sir. So Dr. Buot was our dean when I was introduced to the concept of Satoyama. And since then, this has been part of my research and as well as personal advocacy. So thank you, sir, for bringing me to the Satoyama landscape. And since then, I have done a number of research and produced publication on Satoyama, and I have engaged with some researchers and professors as well. So let me just, I have prepared the presentation, so just to make this more organized. But basically, I just want to say that I definitely agree with all the analysis and appreciation of the current status of Satoyama in the Philippines. We have seen how degraded our natural resources are, and we have done. Sir Buot has mentioned our current projects, but we have been involved in a project initiated by Sir Buot as well since 2012 at the Ifugao Rice Terraces, and as a Satoyama landscape, we have seen that over the years, despite many initiatives, many collaboration across agencies, there's still that problem in terms of conserving and preserving the Ifugao Rice Terraces as a Satoyama landscape. So I just want to agree on what has been presented earlier, but I'm presenting this now from the context of the Ifugao Rice Terraces, because as the project site where we have been for the longest time. And this landscape is really quite unique. So I'm presenting my discussion in the context of the Ifugao Rice Terraces. Because the current program that we are in now, the EIDR program, which we're in this current webinar is anchored on, is actually an offshoot of what we have been doing. We have been engaged with in the Ifugao Rice Terraces as a Satoyama landscape. So I'm anchoring my presentation on that particular case, given that the current project is still ongoing. So I agree with the current problem status that has been presented by Ms. Anne. And from the context of the Ifugaos, there is really that lack of interest from the youth. We have done an extensive study on this. We have talked with Ifugao youths, and there's really a lack of interest from them to sustain or to keep their natural landscape going. Even their cultural landscape is really suffering from the lack of interest among the youth. So there's really a lack of the traditional knowledge as well as the deep appreciation when it comes to their landscape. And we have seen really, out migration once they're able to find more stable jobs. So the Ifugaos, both youth and the working population, would really migrate outside of the Ifugao, leaving the Ifugao Rice Terraces abandoned. So no one's really working on them. So they would go. They will be abandoned, and then as a result, it will result in loss of tradition. And I just want to highlight, this is actually somehow not really a problem, but something that we really should ponder upon, because we all know how valuable education is, and just like any other parents, the Ifugao families would really value formal education, and they would encourage their children to go out of Ifugao to get their degrees. But of course, on the downside, the expense, it will be on the expense of, no one, they will not be able to transfer their traditional knowledge to their children anymore. So that's actually, a something that we all of us should really ponder upon, on how to balance, having the opportunity to get formal education, and then of course at the expense of leaving their cultural and natural landscape behind. And then Anne has also mentioned this, and this is actually across places, not just in the Ifugao provinces, but even the areas where we are working right now, of course. But this is actually very prevalent in the land abandonment, very prevalent in the Ifugao Rice Terraces. There's under management of biocultural diversity, aging and diminishing population due to outmigration. Dr. Buhat and I were involved in the Ifugao Meister Training Program in Ifugao, and this is one of the main objectives of that project, really to look into this aging and diminishing population. Because this is also a problem in Japan. Many of the people who are left in the rural areas are really old people, the elderly, and they're not able to farm anymore. So they have had various initiatives and programs to bring back the youth to the rural areas. And of course, as a result, there's neglect of traditional agricultural practices, poor maintenance, and there's of course urbanization. I think if we have been to the Ifugao Rice Terraces, Banawe is an example of up and coming or urban area, and there's really a need for it to balance how you go about urbanization, and of course there's unregulated tourism activities as well as farmers' economic difficulties. Now, in terms of suggestions or practical solutions, Anne has presented a number of those, but in the context of the Ifugao Rice Terraces, I think based on our research, there is really a need to improve, the youth appreciation towards the Ifugao Rice Terraces as a Satoyama landscape, and this is really by raising their awareness as in terms of capacity building, and of course, because the youth are basically digital natives now. Even in the provinces, they are digital natives. I think there's a need to maximize and optimize the affordances of digital technology. And let me just introduce this as part of my discussion, how UPOU is involved in SEPLS. So we have done case studies specifically on the Ifugao Rice Terraces, and now we're doing the project funded by EIDR across 3 provinces. And this is because UPOU highly advocates sustainability. And we're trying to position ourselves as the university of the future, and this really includes building harmonious relationship with the environment, because the future of a university is not really about technology at all, but really it's about harmonious relationship with people, nature, and technology. So these are the number of programs we have done in the past. Yeah, so let me just run through them. I'm just projecting them so you would have an idea. This is because I'm presenting this because this is our current program is actually an offshoot of many of these programs. Right. Yeah. So we actually produced books both in English as well as in the native languages in Tuwali, and in our current program, this is actually one of the outputs that we hope to produce as well, to come up with materials that we can share to the communities to help revitalize SEPLS. This is very important, as has been emphasized by the speaker. All right. So, affirming the future directions discussed, it is really important that given the wide variation in the socio-ecological makeup of SEPLS globally and locally, as well as in their political and economic context, individual communities will be at the forefront of developing appropriate measures for their unique circumstances. This is according to Saito. Saito is one of our visiting professors, and he helped us develop our proposed Doctor of Sustainability, which we hope to offer very soon. All right, so I think that's it. I hope to discuss more during the Q&A portion. And thank you for this opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Joanne, for that brilliant insight. And that presentation is a very informative indeed. We need to raise awareness na talaga, especially the youth, about the importance of this landscape. So let's proceed at this moment to answer some of the questions of our audience. We will now start accommodating questions from our participants, or if someone would like to raise their questions, you may raise the hand button and wait for you to be acknowledged. So my questions na ba? So for everyone, if you have questions, you can write it into our chat box. Miss Anne, are you ready to answer the questions of our participants?
Yes.
So for the first questions, are the local communities aware of the term socio-ecological production landscape, especially those areas that are yung mga malalayo na?
Yeah. So yeah, thank you for that question. So yes, we are trying to make them more aware actually. So not just the term socio-ecological production landscapes and seascapes, but also the principles behind this term, which is yung Satoyama and Satumi, which is society in harmony with nature. So this is actually what we are aiming, especially this project. We aim that more and more, like yung na-mention nga po kanina ni Doc Joanne, that we want to reconnect the youth, our indigenous communities or indigenous peoples here in the Philippines, to once again be reconnected with their cultural diversity, because indeed they are very rich and they really help in the sustainable management of our ecosystems and biodiversity conservation.
Okay, so may questions dito sa ating room from Nilbert Monvana. So preserving biodiversity is very relevant issue. So how will initiatives on building climate smart communities harness community receptivity, example, indigenous community, especially that free, prior, and informed consent from this community is important in the engagement to these communities?
Yeah. Yes. So yes, it's really important po that we need to have consent from them. But I think it's also important na I think we have this strategy na hindi natin sila biglain with all these for instance, another technology or practices that we can introduce to them. So it's good that we involve them, especially the rich cultural practices or indigenous practices in terms of sustainable management. We can integrate them with the strategies that we have, especially here as an academe and as researchers. So we want them to have a good parang adaptation to that practices or to that strategy. So parang yung collaboration, yung co-management natin with the SEPLS would be more effective. Ayan po. I hope I was able to answer that question.
Okay, so another questions for Albert Mindiola. Hello, ma'am. I am SHS teacher from SDO Camarines Sur. The problem with the community where I am assigned is the parents themselves do not care anymore to their environment. No matter how much I teach them about ecology conservation, it does not matter to them. Is there still anything I can do to convince them that their environment is so important?
I think it's also good that we let them see here the bigger picture. Parang in the long run, how would they see themselves mismo? Paano ba nila nakikita yung future ng environment, for instance, di ba? So, I think it's good that we make them more understand what is at risk, especially now that ang dami ng nangyayari in terms of climate change impacts, and it's really becoming more and more severe somehow, yung mga typhoons and all na nangyayari here in the Philippines. So I think it's also good that we make them more aware of those consequences if we don't act right now. So I think it's also a good strategy to make them more aware of that in the long run, not just yung ngayon po.
So parang kailangan natin na parang bata pa, alam na nila yung importance ng these resources. Ganun din. Okay, so another questions naman is the Satoyama landscape or the socio-ecological production landscape in the Philippines is comparable ba siya sa agroforestry system?
Ayan. So this question is really one of the questions na very very technical somehow now. So in my presentation, there are actually it's really anchored sa mga agroforestry systems po. But we see here, by definition, our SEPLS or Satoyama landscapes are different mosaics of these of these ecosystems, like forest ecosystems. We may also have grasslands ecosystems, and then agroforestry, of course, agricultural, even riparian. It can also be part of the Satoyama landscape or the SEPLS. It's good that these agroforestry systems, I believe, yung indigenous practices which are actually effective in sustainable management. I-akma natin sila or i-anchor natin sila all the more dun sa mga identified na natin na Satoyama landscapes here in the Philippines. Ayan po.
Okay. So I think there's so many questions for our speakers. So we will accept one last question from our participant in Zoom. In promoting conservation of socio-ecological production landscape, how will you convince the LGU or the local government unit if their mindset of the development is commercial-centered cityhood?
Yeah, this is actually especially now, no, parang every year nagkakaroon ng modernization, and parang it's like a global or economic mindset natin to be more developed. But yes, we need to convince them. I believe siguro aakma ko na lang din po sa previous answer ko na there is a need to sustain. We are actually losing this biocultural diversity that we have, and yung even in my researches, indigenous varieties of rice, of of crops are also losing. So, hindi lang po ito just, we need biodiversity conservation and this sustainable management of socio-ecological production landscape can help maintain that biodiversity conservation that we are aiming.
Okay, thank you so much to our speaker, Ms. Anne, for answering the questions of our dear participants and attendees. Thank you also to everyone who sent in their questions in our Zoom chat box. And we regret to inform you that due to time constraints, we cannot accommodate all of the questions. So, but if you have more questions in mind, you may contact Ms. Anne Buhay through her email address at edbuhay@up.edu.ph or send us a message to our Facebook page at Satoyama PH. So for now, we will proceed to the giving of certificates to the speaker and to our discussants. Okay. Let's start first with the speaker. Okay. So for the speaker, please allow me to read the content of the certificate. University of the Philippines Open University present the certificate of appreciation to Ms. Anne Frances Buhay for serving as a resource speaker during the webinar presentation entitled Socioecological Production Landscape in the Philippines, Status, Problems, and Future Direction of the Revitalizing Socioecological Production Landscape and Seascapes. Held on March 31, 2022 via Zoom, signed by Dr. Inocencio Bugot and Dr. Joane V. Serrano. Given this on 31st day of March 2022. Next. And for the certificate of appreciation given to Dr. Joane V. Serrano for serving as a discussant during the webinar paper presentation entitled Socioecological Production Landscape in the Philippines, Status, Problems, and Future Direction of Revitalizing Socioecological Production Landscape and Seascapes. Held on March 31, 2022 via Zoom, signed by Dr. Ricardo T. Bagarino. Given this on 31st day of March 2022. Again, thank you so much to our speaker, Ms. Buhay, and to our discussant, Dr. Joane, for sharing your valuable ideas, knowledge, and expertise for today's webinar. Indeed, we have learned a lot from both of you. So we are now on the last part of today's webinar, and on behalf of the project team, I would like to express my deep appreciation to the speaker and discussant for their valuable contribution to our webinar series, Revitalizing Socio-Ecological Production, Landscape, and Seascape. I would also like to acknowledge our participants who participated and attended the webinar and contributed to its success. Also, a special thanks to Dr. Buot, our dear mentor and project leader for supervising this event. We hope that you learned a lot from our speaker and discussant today, and we also hope that you find this topic useful to your respective fields. Okay, before we will end this webinar, I humbly request everyone to turn on your camera for the photo opportunity. Okay, ready na ba ang lahat? Okay. 3, 2, 1, smile. Okay, next page. 3, 2, 1, smile. Thank you very much, everyone. The link for the evaluation form is now shared on the Zoom chat box. We will request everyone to please complete the evaluation form for your e-certificates. Just also a quick reminder, we will stop accepting evaluation after 24 hours. For the announcement, Um, we have announcement. We would like to invite you on our next topic of our webinar series entitled Reimagining Agricultural Landscape for Ecosystem Restoration Using Permaculture Design, to be presented by our next guest speaker, Dr. Jabez Flores. This will take place on April 29 from 10 to 11 a.m. Interested participants may register by scanning the QR code or use the link provided. Okay, that brings us to the end of our webinar for today. Thank you once again for attending and participating in our webinar today. We hope to see you on the next webinar series on April 29. Thank you very much.